So, get this. Today we're diving into a true crime story that might remind you of, well, the Hardy Boys, but instead of solving mysteries, this duo from New Orleans, they were making headlines for all the wrong reasons, really.
Oh, yeah.
We're taking that Wikipedia article you send over, and we're going to really dissect their rise and fall. And trust me, it's a wild ride.
It's a fascinating case, really,
Yeah.
especially when you consider the backdrop. The late 80s and early 90s, when so many American cities were dealing with just a surge in drug-related violence. The Hardy Boys, Wayne and Paul, cool Hardy, really capture that dark side of that era.
Yeah, they weren't exactly out there solving mysteries, more like creating them. So to understand how these guys operate, we need to go beyond just names and dates, right? What made them tick?
Well, I think their organization is a classic example of what we call racketeering. But it's more than just a fancy word. These guys were running a full-blown criminal enterprise.
Right.
We're talking extortion, money laundering, and a whole lot of violence just to maintain their grip on power.
So not your typical family business, huh? And it sounds like they weren't afraid to make a statement right from the start. Their first big headline grabber was the murder of Jerome Andrews in 1988. And it wasn't exactly subtle. We're talking a drive-by shooting.
Yeah, that's right. And then, if that wasn't bold enough, just a year later, in 1989, they orchestrate a whole shooting spree at the Florida projects. That left one person, Michael Handy, dead, and 4 others wounded. It's actually chilling to think about. They were even shot at again as they were being wheeled into the hospital.
Wow, that's intense. It really sounds like they were sending a message, and a pretty brutal one. But here's the crazy part. They were acquitted of these charges, so was this just a case of them getting lucky?
Well, it might be more than just luck. The justice system at that time, it faced numerous challenges, and securing convictions in cases that involved gangs was incredibly difficult. Witnesses were often just too scared to testify. Evidence was hard to come by. And there were even instances of, corruption within law enforcement itself.
So a system struggling to keep up with all this violence, and the Hardy Boys took full advantage. But they weren't just, like, thugs with guns, right? Their business, it had layers.
Oh, absolutely. To really understand their power,
Yeah.
you have to look at their drug operation. They were heavily involved in heroin distribution. It wasn't just street-level dealing either. They had a sophisticated network for moving large quantities of drugs. And they were ruthless about protecting their turf.
And just to make sure everyone knew they weren't messing around, like the 1990 robbery at the Skate City roller rink, where they snatched earrings, talk about brazen, and then the murder of Ulcie White in 1992, a case that still remains unsolved to this day. Were these just random acts or part of a larger strategy?
It's hard to say for certain. What is clear, though, is that the Hardy Boys were operating in a world where violence was just a tool for control, for sending a message, and for eliminating rivals. But the incident with Joe Strader, it allegedly involved their own brother, Lionel, over some money owed, shows that even within their own circle, things weren't exactly harmonious.
So even family, it was all about business. But things really started heating up in 1994. A turf war erupts in the Florida projects. And Paul Hardy, it seems like he goes on a personal mission to eliminate the competition.
Yeah, this wasn't just a rivalry. This was a battle for control, for dominance, really, in a very lucrative market. And Paul Hardy, he showed just how ruthless he was willing to be. First, it was Corey Richardson, allegedly murdered to keep him quiet. Then it was Carlos Adams, shot multiple times.
And it just escalates from there. Sean King and Troy Watts' ambush, they weren't shy about using some serious firepower either. I mean, assault weapons were part of their arsenal. What fueled this sudden increase in violence?
Oh, turf wars were common, especially during the crack epidemic. These conflicts often stemmed from competition over drug distribution territories, but they were also exacerbated by just the influx of weapons and the culture of fear that was really permeating those communities.
So a complex mix of factors driving this deadly spiral. But then, to make things even more complicated, we have the entrance of Len Davis, a New Orleans police officer nicknamed the Desire Terrorist. And this is where things get really interesting. How does a cop end up entangled with guys like the Hardy Boys?
Well, this is where the story takes a turn, towards institutional corruption. Davis wasn't just turning a blind eye. He was actively aiding the Hardy Boys, feeding them information, providing protection, in exchange for, well, who knows what.
Talk about a betrayal of the badge. They
Wrong.
basically had an inside man, making their operation even more difficult to penetrate. And sadly, this corrupt relationship, it had deadly consequences.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought. A police officer not only condoning this level of violence, but enabling it. And it all culminates in the tragic murder of Kim Groves. It seems like she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Well, sadly, Kim Groves was targeted. You see, she had filed a brutality complaint against Len Davis, and he, fearing the consequences, used his connection with Paul Hardy to silence her permanently. It was a cold, calculated act of retaliation.
So this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a deliberate attempt to eliminate a threat. What really stands out to me is the level of premeditation involved. Davis didn't just snap, he planned this out.
Yeah, it's a textbook example of how corruption can just erode the very foundation of justice.
Yeah.
A police officer who's sworn to protect the public becomes a predator, using his position to eliminate anyone who dares to challenge him. It's terrifying, really.
It really does shed a dark light on the power dynamics at play here. But the Hardy Boys couldn't outrun the law forever. Their reign of terror had to come to an end eventually, right?
It did, and ironically, it was their connection to Len Davis that ultimately led to their downfall. The murder of Kim Groves became their undoing. In December 1994, Paul Hardy, along with his accomplice Damon Causey and Len Davis, were all arrested for her murder.
I bet that was a major turning point for authorities. Taking down a dirty cop, especially one as deeply embedded as Davis. It must have been a huge win.
It was a pivotal moment, for sure. The investigation into Davis's activities just opened up a Pandora's box. He wasn't just involved in this one murder. He was implicated in ordering at least 13 killings. It was a systematic elimination of witnesses who dared to speak out against him.
13 killings. It's hard to fathom the depth of his corruption. What were the repercussions for the New Orleans Police Department? This had to shake things up.
Absolutely. Davis's arrest sent shockwaves through the entire department. The FBI launched Operation Shattered Shield, which was a full-scale investigation into corruption within the ranks. Several officers connected to Davis were suspended, and the whole department was just forced to confront this systemic rot that had taken hold.
So a reckoning of sorts for the New Orleans Police Department, a forced confrontation with its own dark side. What was the ultimate outcome for Paul Hardy and Len Davis? Did they face justice for their actions?
They did. Both were convicted for the murder of Kim Groves, and they received life sentences. A fitting punishment considering the gravity of their crimes.
Life sentences. A small measure of justice, I guess, for the lives they destroyed. But what about Wayne? He was a key part of the Hardy Boys operation. What happened to him?
Well, Wayne's ending is shrouded in mystery. In 1996, just 2 years after his brother's arrest, he was found shot to death in a car, along with a woman, on S. Carrollton and Tillian Avenue.
That's an unsettling end. Was his death ever connected back to his past? To the Hardy Boys' criminal enterprise? Or was it just a tragic coincidence?
That's the big question that lingers. The circumstances surrounding his death, they remain unclear. Was it a settling of old scores, retaliation for past deeds, or was he just caught in a completely unrelated act of violence? We're left to speculate.
It adds another layer of intrigue to this already fascinating story. But beyond the crimes, beyond the violence, what does this whole saga tell us about the broader context? The Hardy Boys, they didn't operate in a vacuum, did they?
Right. Their story goes beyond just these individuals. It exposes the vulnerabilities of a system that's grappling with poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunity. And it highlights how those factors create a breeding ground for crime and corruption to flourish.
So it's not just about the Hardy Boys themselves, but about the environment that allowed them to thrive. They were both products and exploiters of that vulnerability, weren't they?
Absolutely. Their rise was facilitated by a system that often failed its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them susceptible to the allure of easy money and the sense of belonging that gangs can provide.
It's like their story is a microcosm of the larger societal struggles happening in New Orleans at the time. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that this story, as horrific as it is, has valuable lessons for us today. The fight for justice, for equality, and for accountability. It's an ongoing battle. It requires us to be vigilant, to think critically, and to challenge the status quo.
It's easy to get caught up in the true crime aspect of it all, but we have to remember that these are real lives, real communities, forever impacted by these events.
Exactly. And by understanding the forces that shape these stories, we become more informed citizens, better equipped to advocate for positive change.
So it's not just about learning from the past, but using that knowledge to build a better future.
Precisely. The Hardy Boys saga is a cautionary tale, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with the issues that matter, to speak truth to power, and to work towards a more just and equitable society.
That's a powerful message. So, to our listener, I hope this deep dive into the Hardy Boys story has sparked your curiosity, There's so much more to explore, whether it's the history of New Orleans, the impact of the drug war, or the fight against police corruption. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How many other Hardy Boys are out there, trapped in these cycles? But I'm curious, this all happened in New Orleans, a city known for its vibrant culture, its history. Do you think the city itself played a role in how this all unfolded?
It's an interesting point. New Orleans, it has a unique history, a unique culture, but it's also a city marked by these social and economic disparities. And we can't forget the impact of Hurricane Katrina, which really amplified many of these issues. It's like the city itself embodies this struggle between resilience and vulnerability.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Maybe those same forces were at play in the lives of the Hardy Boys, too. They were both products and exploiters of that vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. Their rise, it's facilitated by a system that often failed its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them susceptible to, the allure of easy money and that sense of belonging that gangs can provide.
It's like their story is a microcosm of the larger struggles happening in New Orleans at that time. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
That's a good question. I think the most important takeaway is that this story, as horrific as it is, it has some valuable lessons for us today. The fight for justice, for equality, for accountability, it's an ongoing battle. It requires us to be vigilant, to think critically, and to always be challenging the status quo.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the true crime aspect of it all, but we have to remember these are real lives, real communities forever impacted by these events.
Exactly. And by understanding the forces that shape these stories, we become more informed citizens, better equipped to advocate for positive change.
So it's not just about learning from the past, it's about using that knowledge to build a better future.
Precisely. The Hardy Boys saga, it's a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with the issues that matter, to speak truth to power, and to work towards a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's a powerful message. So to our listener out there, I hope this deep dive into the Hardy Boys story has sparked your curiosity. There's so much more to explore here, whether it's the history of New Orleans, the impact of the drug war, or the fight against police corruption. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. That's all for this deep dive. Catch you next time.